Can he do it?
If I can see it, then I can do it.
You gotta show me the shit. Better tell you how I'm doing this shit.
DeMar DeRozan and Blake Griffin are two of the most notable names the league has had over the last decade or so of basketball. So in today's video, we're going to be taking the time to dive deeper into these two players' careers by the numbers and try to determine which of these guys is the better player. Make sure you stick around until the end of the video to find out which of these two guys we think is better, and I'll give you a hint, this is an unbelievably close race. So the first thing we got to talk about here is scoring. It's hard to be considered the best of two stars if you don't score the ball well. Starting with DeMar DeRozan, DeMar averages 20.8 points per game throughout his career, though his shooting percentages are not that great. He shoots a career 46.5% from the field and 83.8% from the charity stripe, but it gets bad when you look at those three-point numbers. He shoots just 28.7% from three-point range. But granted, he barely even attempted three-pointers early on in his career because he just wasn't comfortable letting them fly. Now, his best season came just a year ago with the Chicago Bulls. He was scoring a total of 27.9 points per game with his new team, his best average by just a little bit. The only other season that came within 3 points was his 27.3 points per game average that came with the Toronto Raptors in 2016. Now, flipping over to Blake Griffin, he averages 19.7 points per game over his career. His shooting is better from everywhere except for the free throw line, though. Griffin shoots 49.3% from the field, 32.8% from behind the arc, and 69.6% from the charity stripe. Blake's best season when it came to scoring happened back in 2018-2019 with the Detroit Pistons, as he averaged 24.5 points a night with them. So I think it's safe to say that DeMar should be considered slightly better in the scoring category than Blake. DeRozan shoots significantly better from the free throw line and just slightly worse from the field and from three, but he also averages more over his career and he has a better season high. And personally, I'd rather lean on somebody like DeMar to give me a bucket rather than Griffin one-on-one. Alright, let's also cover the rebounding category really quick, though this is a pretty easy one to determine. DeMar averages 4.4 boards per game over his career, with his single season peak being 6 boards per game. He also doesn't average a single offensive rebound per game over his career. Meanwhile, Griffin averages 8.2 rebounds per game over his career. And in case you weren't convinced that this race was already over, Griffin's best single season when it came to rebounding was his rookie year when he snagged 12.1 rebounds a game. He also averages 2 offensive rebounds over the course of his career, so Griffin is definitely the better rebounder here. Now let's cover the other end of the court, defense. DeMar averages 1 steal and 0.3 blocks per game over his career. Obviously, the blocks are a little less than you'd hope for out of a forward that's DeMar's size, but the steals aren't horrible. It's clear that he's more of an offensive weapon than a defensive one, though. As for Blake, he's averaging 0.8 steals and 0.5 blocks per game throughout his career. Now, shockingly, he's worse on the defensive end than DeMar when it comes to creating turnovers. And that's not the only thing that can determine which player is a better defender, though. We can also take a look at defensive rating. A better defensive rating is one that is lower compared to a higher one. DeMar peaked his defensive rating at 106.9 with the Toronto Raptors, but just had the worst rating of his career with the Bulls at 115.3 last year. The overall average for DeMar is in the 108 rating range. Griffin's peak, on the other hand, was at 102.2 with the Los Angeles Clippers. He even repeated those efforts with 103.3 in 2 other years, all of those being better than DeMar's best defensive season. Blake has dropped far down the rating in the past few years in the league with the Boston Celtics and the Pistons, but still, at the end of the day, I would say that if both players were in their prime, I'd rather have Griffin on the defensive end. In his peak, he was incredibly close to a 100 defensive rating. Now, before we move on to the next section, let's take a brief break to show you some highlights.
We're in the Movado last minute of tonight's game, and DeRozan hits! Bulls lead!
Let's see if they double team him, get the ball out of his hands. DeRozan fires for the lead. Compton's finest does it again. Oh my goodness.
Butler now on the wing. Balls for the screen. 2-man game. Blake Griffin explodes on Gasol. Boy left wide open. Griffin, oh wow! Incredible rebound putback.
Now, we haven't done our job in comparing these two guys unless we look at their head-to-head matchups. We've seen DeMar take on Blake a total of 21 times over their careers. All of those games were in the regular season. And out of those games, DeMar has been able to help his team win more often, taking 12 out of the 21. That means Blake has only won 9 of them. Unfortunately for Griffin, the stats aren't really in his favor either. DeRozan averages 22.7 points, 5.2 rebounds, and 4.8 assists per game in the head-to-head matchups. Griffin, on the other hand, averages 18.7 points, 6.5 rebounds, and 4.5 assists per game. Rebounding is all that Blake does better in these games against DeMar, which makes it incredibly hard to say that Griffin's been the better head-to-head player in this debate. Now, let's move on to accolades. First things first, neither of these guys has won an NBA championship yet at this stage in their careers. DeRozan has played in 14 seasons, making it into the postseason 7 times and getting named onto 5 All-Star teams. Additionally, he was listed on an All-NBA team 3 times, but not one of them saw him make it onto the first team. Now, as for Griffin, Blake has played in 13 seasons in the league and has seen the playoffs 9 times, 2 times more than DeMar. Griffin also has 1 more All-Star game with 6 compared to DeMar's 5. The accolades category gets even more one-sided because Griffin has 2 more All-NBA selections at 5, but just like DeMar, none of them were first-team selections. And then finally, Griffin does have an NBA Rookie of the Year award under his belt too, so I think it's pretty safe to say that Blake is the winner of the accolades section. Alright, so the last thing that we need to cover is the impact on their team's success. Now, we've seen that Blake has been able to make it into 2 more postseasons than DeMar. However, these guys have had totally different roles in those appearances. DeMar was leading the charge on practically every single postseason run that he's made so far. He was the main guy with the Toronto Raptors. Of course, they did have Kyle Lowry, but DeMar was certainly still the top dog. And he was the top guy too during his years with the San Antonio Spurs, and the same goes for his years with the Bulls so far. But as for Blake, he's only once been the top guy. With the Los Angeles Clippers, he had both DeAndre Jordan and Chris Paul to form Lob City, and then in Detroit, he was able to lead them into the postseason by being that top guy. But in his recent stints with the Celtics and the Brooklyn Nets, he's been nothing more than just a fringe role player for 2 already good teams. So I'd say that over their careers, DeMar has been more important to his team's success compared to Blake, who is usually known as a phenomenal second option on a good team. So, with all that said, we've covered all the categories, and I'm gonna say that I'd rather have DeMar DeRozan on my team than Blake Griffin. DeMar is somebody who can be utilized as a superstar player compared to Blake, who's better suited for a secondary role. Now, Blake is the better defender, but DeMar is the more impactful scorer who has shown himself to be consistently getting the better of Blake in head-to-head matchups. This was certainly not an easy debate, don't get me wrong, but we just gotta consider where the guys are right now as well, and it's so obvious that Griffin just isn't as useful as he once was on the floor. Meanwhile, DeMar is having the best year of his career in another top role on the Bulls, where he has complete freedom to score whenever he wants. So let us know down below in the comments if you think we should have gone with Blake instead, or if we got it right with DeMar, and let us know why too.